You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, and even a little bit of news and gossip with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today, we are talking to intellectual property manager Seth Berg. And now, here's Arthur.
Seth Berg is unique in show business. We all know of great recording artists, and a lot of them have left the planet Earth. And Seth represents a lot of those people. He has represented and been involved with Frank Sinatra's estate, as well as Dean Martin, Peggy Lee, Nat Cole, and others. So when you hear music playing wherever you hear it these days, whether it be in movies or advertising on television, or recordings, or in Italian restaurants, Seth has a hand in that. And we want to talk to him today about all of that. And Seth, nice to see you here. And I'm curious, so I go into an Italian restaurant and I hear a recording by Frank Sinatra.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, if you hear a recording by Frank in there, usually it's some kind of music license now. So, it's either somebody that's gotten you on a playlist, something to that effect. Unfortunately, for the recording artists, we don't get paid for that because that's actually considered a public performance. And so public performances, the writers get paid. And the guys that I represent, except for Peggy Lee, we're not songwriters. So when you go in and hear that, that's the reason why when you see a band complaining that a presidential candidate is using their music, that's a fair use. That's a public performance of the recording. It just happens to be caught by the news cameras, which is considered a fair use. That's why very few of them can do anything about it. It's when it's recorded and captured for us that it comes into play. But you're allowed to play music publicly and not get paid for it, unless you're the writer.
But don't recording artists get paid for things like Spotify, YouTube, their airplays?
Yeah, but you might go into a restaurant. I don't know if that's a music license, if that's just a public performance play. We don't necessarily get paid because it's playing in paid because it's being played in an Italian restaurant. We may get paid if it's on a playlist that just happens to be played in the Italian restaurant. So that could, certainly be the case. We just don't know where those, where necessarily they're playing that from. But if you go in and they're just playing the radio, like the old days, that's not something we get paid for.
Okay.
Seth, when I was on the radio for many years in New York City and around the country, the stations, this is way before the internet, would pay ASCAP and BMI a license for the year. And
Correct.
Then you could do whatever you want. Is that what happens now in the streaming world?
Yeah, that's what happens for any restaurant. If you go into a restaurant and they've got live music, karaoke, jukebox, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, we'll have representatives that go in there, and it's like a menu of items that you tick off, and that decides how much a restaurant will pay. And that actually has the weight of the federal government behind it. So you might be a local restaurant, you decide not to pay, they can actually come in and pull your license from you and stop you from being able to operate. So it's a pretty powerful organization. But ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, those are writers' performance organizations. What I deal with primarily, I deal with everybody, but primarily it's artists. And so that they don't really have any say for my clients over any of the streaming stuff.
So, Seth, when I was little, I wanted to design jet planes. That was kind of my first pursuit until I discovered I was terrible in geometry. But let's talk about you as a youth, or a ute, as Fred Gwynn once said, and my cousin Vinny. When you were a ute, what were your early passions?
Movies. I just loved movies. I was 7 years old, and I was taken to see Star Wars in a drive-in. And it changed my life. I mean, it absolutely changed my life, and started with, all the action figures and the toys, and then seeing Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and sitting till the end of the movies to see who did that. I've never seen anything like that. And just being infatuated by the credits, and then learning what a best boy was and a key grip and all those, those crazy titles that you saw at the end of movies. Like, what is a best boy? And so I always, always, always wanted to be in the entertainment business. And after I graduated college, I told my parents, I'm packing up, I'm going to California, and moved out here and said,
Where were you brought up, Seth? What city?
Philadelphia. So fly, Eagles, fly.
Eagles, yes, fly.
Well, yeah, and your granddad was a musician, I think, played the piano. I think, didn't your aunt sing opera? I mean, you had a lot of music in the background, didn't you?
A lot of music in the family. Both grandfathers were professional piano players. One of them came out here with my father's parents came out here because they were New Yorkers. And he developed asthma. And, back then they'd say, get to a dry climate. And so they came out to Los Angeles, where my grandfather did a lot of stage work, a lot of film work. I forget some of the people that he worked with, but I have his 8x10s around here, where he did a lot of movie, playing the piano in the movie background, that type of stuff. And my other grandfather, my mother's father, was a professional piano player in Philadelphia for 72 years. Wow. I don't think he ever missed a day of work. That was the obituary. And pretty much nobody ever thought that he did. There was a bar downstairs after when the Great Depression hit, and my great-grandmother sent my grandfather out and said, get a job. And he went downstairs, and it was a black bar. Basically, it was African-American bar. And he went in, and they put him on the piano, and he played bum 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 till he was 20. He said, I never learned anything else. And one day I went, I better do something else with this, and became a self-taught jazz musician.
But that was a good commute for him.
It was a great commute for him. Yeah. Then they moved to Jersey, and it was a little bit different back then. There were no freeways, so it was all back roads, and good luck getting over one bridge back then. Now there's, I think, 4. It was difficult.
Where did you go to college, Seth?
Penn State.
Oh, Happy Valley.
Happy Valley. Yes, sir.
And what was your first show business job?
Well, when I got out here, my first show business job was I got extra work right away, because I really didn't know. I knew I wanted to be in movies, maybe television. Music was not on the radar at all. I didn't even know that was a business. I knew it was a career, but only for musicians. And I got out here, and within a couple of weeks, I was on Melrose Place and 90210. And of course, my family thought, oh my God, he's made it. This is the most unbelievable thing ever. And I worked pretty consistently. And, you could make pretty decent money. It wasn't bad, super fun. And I did everything from not Deep Space Nine. There was another, Babylon 5. I'm a tall guy. I'm 6'1", and they put me in all the makeup. I was supposed to be this alien, and makeup and, contact lenses and 6-inch heels. And I remember going into the bathroom. I wish I had cell phone back then, and not even recognizing myself. So I had just the greatest time ever.
Didn't you also get involved with the American President, with Richard Dreyfuss?
That's exactly what happened. Yeah, I got pulled out of the extra pool, and they said, go around the corner and go talk to Rob. We need you for this other role. And so Rob, being Rob Reiner, I didn't know that. I walked around the corner with 2 other guys. They put me with Richard Dreyfuss. So I was his photographer, and I guess I fit the suit. And they pulled another kid out that I was friends with. They gave him, actually, Annette Bening gave him a line. I didn't get a line, unfortunately. But that got me into Taft-Hartley with SAG, right? So then all of a sudden, my next gig, I got called back to Melrose Place. I had my first line. And then I got called back on something else. I walked on Roger Corman's set, which is non-union, but I ended up getting another line. Anyway, I had to pay my union dues at that point. I couldn't get any more work. And I couldn't afford it. It was like $1,500 or something for to pay the SAG fees. So I had to get a temp job. And the business changed for me at that point. All of a sudden, now you had to go meet casting directors and producers, and you had to go to lunches, and you had to go over to people's offices. You don't get paid for that part of it. So I got a temp job, and went through a few of those until one day I ended up at Capitol Records, and probably about 1995, and they were just starting to computerize. They had just gotten desktops, and they realized that they were computerizing their files, their library, their tape library, for example, because they had gone through Northridge. They had to move. All their tape libraries were in Pasadena. The building was condemned after the Northridge quake, so they were forced to move out to the valley and started this digitization process. And one thing they realized was that none of the departments were talking to each other. So the sales guys would be selling to a client, operations would be manufacturing, shipping to the client, and legal could never get the contract signed by the client. And none of them were talking to each other to know that, hey, sales, don't sell to this guy anymore until we get the contract signed from the past deals. So I came in, they said, do you know IT? I said, oh, of course I do. Can do anything. I learned that as an extra. Can you ride a horse? Yes, I can ride a horse. Can you do stunt kicking? Sure. You want a squib? Can we put a squib on your forehead? The explosive gun pack that looks like you've been Sure, go ahead. So that's what happened. And I ended up at Capitol Records, and I never left. I fell in love with it. Absolutely fell in love with it.
And so that got you into representing various estates, Seth?
Well, the music. So I was at Capitol Records. I was in the special markets division, which back then dealt with alternative markets to traditional retail. So when you would go into Starbucks isn't a traditional retailer, right? But you'd go in and you'd see CDs on the front counter. Or when you would go to Sears at Christmas and you spend $50 and you get a Christmas CD. So that's what this department did. And they put inside that department what's called the sync department. And the sync department married all of the music owned by Capitol, EMI, all the labels into film, television, commercials, all these great things. And it was really an irrelevant department back then. I mean, the big chill had sort of hit, 20 years earlier. Pulp Fiction had certainly had a great run with music and old music, but nothing like it is today. The internet hadn't quite hit yet, so that really exploded everything. And it was a two-person department, and they were two older New Yorkers who fell in love with this East Coast kid and said, hey, our assistant's leaving. Do you want a job with us? And I said, yeah, absolutely. This will be amazing. And it was just this marriage of everything. Any kid that wanted to be in the entertainment business, this was the job. I mean, we were in the music we're in a music company, but we're considered network and studio guys inside Capitol Records. When I would go to Warner Brothers, they called us a label guy. When I would go to the networks, we were record guys. It was just, we never quite fit in anywhere, but we touched every single thing, everything.
But you also had an interesting story regarding contracts and how they were written. Didn't you get involved with helping them kind of make one contract up?
Insane. Yeah, the lady that was our contract manager would type every agreement. And she knew the agreements by heart at this point. I mean, and she would just type them all up. They never had put together a schedule. Because this department was so isolated, we didn't even have a lawyer. There was no access to legal. I mean, it was just insane. And going back to you, Arthur, how did I get to meet all these people? We had free reign and access to every artist on the label, where a lot of the other departments, there were layers. You didn't want everybody going to the Beatles. You didn't want some kid talking to D. Martin or the Sinatra estate. Those were coveted, important relationships. And, one wrong move could set off a terrible, cascading event. You say something wrong or someone asks you to do something and you say, sure, and turns out you shouldn't have done it. So we had access to everybody. So, going back to Steve Blauner, Arthur, who was Bobby Darin's manager. So I had read Easy Rider and Raging Bulls. Yep. And I read about Steve Blauner in there and how he had created the Monkees, and he was a producer on 5 Easy Pieces and Easy Rider and all these just great things. So I'm like, this got to be the same Steve Blauner. So I called him up and, Steve, is this you in the book? It sure is. I said, can I have lunch with you? I just want to hear stories. And once that happened, I started reaching out to Dean Martin's manager, a guy named Mort Viner, who was just this legendary, manager in town. And I just wanted to hear the stories. And they loved this East Coast, young Jewish kid, wanting to even pay attention to him. And I built up these great relationships with the Sinatras, Dean Martin, the Nat Cole estate, because I just really wanted to hear the stories. And and then I'd end up helping them. I became their point person internally. The two people that I had worked for gradually retired and moved on. I rose up in the company. Then the internet hit, and that just changed the entire business. Everybody wanted standards.
Was Sinatra living when you joined that team?
He was, yeah.
Did you get a chance to meet him?
Never met any of my clients, unfortunately. No. They were pretty shielded back then. Frank was pretty old. I know when he did Duets 2, I was at the label, and they shut that down like the President of the United States came. We were across the street from the Capitol Tower, and back then it wasn't all gated up. Nobody was trying to kill the president of the label back then, so you could freely walk onto the Capitol lot, and that was boarded up like there was no tomorrow.
You knew Rick Finkelstein, yes?
Seth? Well, I know Bob Finkelstein is Rick's brother.
Bob,
Rick unfortunately passed, but Bob runs the Sinatra estate.
Yeah, so you knew all the guys who were running the estates.
Yeah, back then it was Sinatra's original business manager, Sonny Golden, and Bob came in a little bit later. So I always tease Bob that I'm actually involved in the Sinatra estate longer than him.
What about Mickey Rudin? Wasn't he involved with Sinatra?
Yeah, Mickey was done by that point with me. He had come in on I think Duets 2, he might have come in where I met him when he came in and teased me about how he had A&R'd all the music for the moon landing. Yeah. But wouldn't tell me what was on it. It's only him and Neil Armstrong and Buzz know what was on it. I tried to get it out of him, America. I tried. He wouldn't give it up.
Yeah, because I think it's an incredible story. If you would tell the story about Louis Prima and the fact that he was nowhere at one point.
That's true. No, it's amazing. So, like I said, the .com craze starts to explode. Everybody's got more money than they can imagine. And I get a call one day from a friend of mine, and he says, hey, we're looking for country line dance music. We had one of the great labels with country music, Capital Nashville, Garth Brooks, God almighty, Glenn Campbell. I mean, just amazing group of artists on the label back then. I don't know who else is on there now. And unfortunately, none of them would do sync. So they were not interested in doing this commercial. It was for The Gap, and The Gap was trying to do the first sort of stop motion where the cameras swing around and capture a dance from all different directions. Probably most people would know it best from the Matrix movies, where the camera sort of spins around while all the action happens. So I didn't have that, but I had this phenomenal CD of swing dance music, which was a huge craze back in 97, I think this was. And I sent him this CD, and track 5 was Jump, Jive, and Wail by Louis Prima. And they went for it. They said, oh my God, this is amazing. I said, I'll cut you a great deal on this. It was supposed to be a week-long run. The commercial garnered tons of attention. I mean, tons of attention. And they just kept increasing it and increasing it and increasing it. We ended up with hundreds of thousands of dollars on this thing. Unbeknownst to me, I'm in the hallway one day. Like I said, we were a very isolated department. Nobody talked with us. We weren't invited to meetings. Nobody cared what we did. And the head of catalog comes running up to me one day, Mark Rashbud. He goes, what the hell is going on with Louis Prima? What, did you guys do something with Louis Prima? We're like blowing out CDs with this guy. I'm like, yeah, we just put him in a Gap commercial. And here he goes, I know that commercial. I didn't know that was Louis Prima. This was before the cell phone and Shazam and all that stuff. People just didn't know. And he said, we were going to delete him from the catalog. So when you get to about 5,000 units, they don't manufacture. So they just stop. And they were going to delete him from the catalog. He had not sold. And at the end of the day, the publisher of the song, independent guy in New York, he was getting ready to sell. He's like, I got nothing. I can't pay anybody. I'm like really struggling here. We pulled him out of basically bankruptcy because of this, because he got the same plus the performance money, ASCAP and BMI. We don't get that on the master side. Louis Prima gets a star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame, so Keeley shows up and gets that. Louis gets reset in the entire Capitol system, because we end up finding out Louis Prima had signed his royalties away in the 50s because he owed so much money to the mob in Vegas on gambling debts. They were going to kill him. And Capitol couldn't give him up. He was a huge star for them. And they paid off his gambling debts. So we got his royalties reinstated. It just turned into this really amazing thing off of this commercial in an obscure department. And we made, almost $400,000 on it on top of it. It's just really great. Yeah.
It's a great story. It's a great story.
And there's tons of those types of stories where these people got pulled out of this type of thing.
Now, Seth, you worked with Maria Cole as relates to Nat. Is that right?
That is correct.
All right. Now, so I must tell the guys about Maria Cole. I lived in Boston at the time, and I had a gentleman drove me, and his name was Bill Altshuler, who was the twin brother of a guy named Bob Altshuler, who was the head of jazz records at this Columbia Records. So Bill was a great lover of music, and he had all these CDs in a Woody station wagon. And he drove like 10 people in Boston, whoever they may have been. I was one of them. So one night I fly in from Los Angeles, and it was a snowstorm. And he came running up to me at the luggage thing. He said, do you mind if I have Maria Cole with me tonight? Would you mind if Maria drove? Of course. So I now meet Maria Cole. Gorgeous. Late 60s, right?
Yeah,
so
probably.
Beautiful woman. I mean, absolutely beautiful. So we're driving in a snowstorm together, and we're talking nice. And I said, Maria, I can do a great impression of Nat. Don't do it. It's okay. You don't have to do it. Everybody in the world did an impression of Nat Cole. Well, anyway, somewhere along the line, a couple of months later, we were driving together again. He said, go ahead and do it. If you want to do it, Arthur. I got to know her. I loved her. God, I love Maria Cole. She was always going out to see it, but Natalie, and she had twin daughters and stuff. And she said, go ahead, do it. If you want to do it, do it. So I said, okay, Mona Lisa. And I got the one note. She says, that's enough. That was good. Very good. Don't ever do it again. Don't do it again. Okay, but that's it. You had your chance. And she was great. And the thing about Nat Cole that a lot of people don't understand was he may have had more hits than anybody who ever was in the business. This guy was a hit machine. And those records live to this day. Do they not, Seth?
Yeah, they sure do. No, it's amazing. It is amazing. So we ended up selling Nat's estate during the height of COVID, when everybody was cashing out of their businesses. As you probably remember, Springsteen, Dylan, everybody was selling all of their assets. So we sold to Irving Azoff's company, Iconic. So we sold that in 2021. We also sold most of Dean Martin's estate to them too. So, cashing out. Everybody anticipated that capital gains would go up. They were the lowest they'd been in 4 years. They thought, Biden would get in, the Democrats would change the rules and up the capital gains. So now's the time to cash out when you're in your mid 70s. Let's, get out of there while you can. And, amazing amount of hits. I mean, when we were doing the due diligence on that, just to read, even, I'd worked with it for 30 years at that point, and just to refresh yourself on how much he had changed music and never was credited for it. The first person to bring Latin music into the United States. He had this unbelievable manager from Honduras named Carlos Gastel. And Carlos said to him, you got to get to Latin America. They will never forget you. And they would go to Latin America. They'd fill these bullfighting stadiums. And if you could come in and sit on the floor, on the dirt floor, you got in for free. And everybody paid, sat in the seats around, and they never forgot it. There's these great photos. You can find some of them online where all these people are, watching Nat perform. He was the first to go to Europe without the USO after the war, first to play in Germany, first to be in Japan after the war, first to go to Australia as an African-American. And they put him on television in 1961. They didn't put a black person on TV until 1970. 72, something like that. They blur out their faces.
Maria confirmed a story to me that I had read at one time, that he was initially going to sing the Christmas song, Chestnuts That Roasting on the Open Fire, with his trio. And Maria said, you should do this. You should put strings into this. And she was the person responsible for that happening. And of course, the record became all-time great stuff. And they make money on that every Christmas. It's always playing.
Well, there's actually 3 versions of the Christmas song. So the first version is with the trio, and that's 1952. Then there's 1958. Then they added all of those strings in 1960. Yeah, they added all those in 61, 62. That's the version everybody knows.
Yeah.
And I listened to that. There's 21 takes, I believe, of that song. And to hear the evolution of how you get to the most iconic Christmas song on the planet,
yes,
is just absolutely amazing. And you can hear
Seth,
he's very sick.
I had that with Bobby Darin on Mac the Knife. I heard 27 takes of Mac the Knife, and the evolution of it was amazing because early on it wasn't there, and then the Hut Huts came in and stuff came in, and somewhere along the line he caught. So I think most people don't know that there are a lot of recording artists have these versions that are outtakes before they get to the one that has that certain kind of something in it. But I can't believe that he had that many versions of it's just such a beautiful original, feels so easy, nice and normal.
Now, I'm not a music guy. I'm more of a movie guy. But occasionally I hear little facts and I talk to musicians. And the general feeling I hear is that today musicians don't make any money from selling records or CDs, or they make all their money from touring. Now, how do you deal with the fact that none of your people can tour?
Yeah, we get on streaming services. That's the big thing for us. If you're going to sell actual audio music, that's where you have to go. The nice thing is that for my clients, box sets. So the more expensive the product is, you can sell 1,000 copies to Uber fans for any of my clients. You will find them globally. And it's very interesting. Europe really started this model. The UK started it, where they were moving out of CDs before we did, and they were moving into streaming. And then they went back to CDs because they realized somebody would spend £100 for a box set of Queen before they would spend £10 on Queen's greatest hits. And so that has all shifted. So when we do physical product, it's a very high-end, 5.1 surround sound album. That's $50. Or a box set with maybe some outtakes in it, some video content. But most of the time you're fighting for playlisting on the streaming services. And then the sync business, you want to get placed in television, film, commercials. How do I keep Natalie Cole, Frank Sinatra, Peggy Lee alive to a new generation of people? They might not be tuned into the playlisting, play music from 1950. They might not be interested in that. But when they're watching a TV show and they hear that music, they might be apt to Shazam it and add that into their playlist. So that is a very important part of our business.
I remember visiting Peggy Lee at the Waldorf. I was doing a remote, my first remote on my radio show, went to her suite in the Waldorf. There were more pillows on that bed than any shop I've ever seen. And she was out there lying there like a queen. I did 2 hours with her. It was some of the highlights of my career, just to meet her and talk with her. And as you said earlier, Seth, she was a terrific songwriter, whether it's Mañana or It's a Good Day or the songs from Lady and the Tramp. She was very prolific. I think she probably wrote close to 300 songs, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. She was really, really quite amazing and never sold the catalog. So she had the wherewithal to keep it. And she took her granddaughter, who's my boss in the Peggy Lee estate, Holly Foster Wells. She took her on tour with her. And when Holly was 5 or 6 years old, Peggy said, you're going to run this business someday. And really instilled in her, not so much the business of the business, because it's very different today than Peggy being on the road, but instilled in her the values that her grandmother had, the importance of what her grandmother was in pop culture, because you can lose a lot of that today. She was almost 60 years old when she won the Grammy for Is That All There Is in 1969. That's pretty old to win a Grammy for a big song like that.
Written by two rock and roll guys. Unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, could you imagine those three egos together trying to get that creative process?
Is there still a pretty active Seth Peggy Lee business?
Yes, absolutely. We do a booming licensing business for television and film and commercials. People love her music. And I think part of the reason is people don't necessarily hear Peggy Lee and think, oh, that's Peggy Lee. I mean, Arthur, you experienced this with Bobby Darin. People think Sinatra did Mac the Knife. That's always the number one confused performance. So a lot of people don't necessarily associate Peggy Lee with the exception of Fever. So it gives this a feeling of authenticity for people. She recorded things that nobody else recorded for the time period, right? So she recorded songs. You'll see Sinatra will follow Nat Cole in a recording. Nobody really followed Dean. He was a little bit more kitschy, but they all sort of followed each other doing the same songs. Peggy didn't. And if she did do a song, she'd only follow Frank, and she completely changed the arrangement.
Yeah. What happens, Seth? Take us through this. We go to see a movie in the theater some years ago, whatever, not that many years ago, about space. And in the movie, they have Sinatra's recording of "Fly Me to the Moon." How does that work? What happens?
Well, it can work a couple different ways. Sometimes it's written into the script, so it starts right there. The studio gets the script. They turn it over to the music department. The music department comes to us or our record label, in this case, Universal, or me directly, and says, here's what we got. Here's a movie. Here's a brief. Here's where it takes place in space, and we want Fly Me to the Moon. And I go, oh, you're very clever. And then we start talking about budgets. What do you have for music? How is this playing in the opening credits of the film, where you're establishing the entire lay of the land, so to speak? Is it just background as a radio source and sort of inconsequential? For All Mankind is a great example of exactly what you said, Arthur. So that's the TV show on Apple Plus about an alternative view of space travel. The Russians actually land on the moon first, and it spins everything on its head. And then a week later, they land a woman on the moon. So NASA goes crazy and basically fires all the men and says, we have to just put women on the moon. And so the whole thing becomes this a complete alternative reality. And one of the things that the producers reached out to us about was one of the main characters was a Sinatra fan, and they wanted to be able to play him throughout the series. So sometimes that was over the scene. So that would be a bigger price than if he's just listening to it on his iPhone while he's doing work. It's more of a throwaway use.
Is there much negotiating?
For Frank? No, I tell them what the price is.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah, but really it depends on how badly we need something too. If we're putting out a project, I might need this. This might be something that I'm a little bit more flexible with. What if it's a recording we've never done business with? There's a whole host of things. And of course, every artist, I never, believe it or not, did a booming licensing business with Nat King Cole, because his songs tended to be slower, more love-based. They're not upbeat and swingy. There's only a couple of them that are really upbeat and swingy. Orange Colored Sky and LOVE and things like that. But even then, they're all love songs. And so that limited.
Straighten up and fly right, Steph.
Yeah.
Straighten up and fly right.
Absolutely. But there's not many of them. You're exactly right. There's just really not. Yeah, that's another one. But there's not a lot of them. So, with Frank, you got New York, New York. You got Dean Martin, Ain't That a Kick in the Head. You got these great songs that establish shots for Vegas and things. Nat just never had that. So I would always be a little bit more flexible on my pricing for Nat, because I wanted the placement, I needed the placement, and then I knew it would help me in my streaming down the pike with Shazams.
I've actually been binge watching For All Mankind, so and obviously it's very period and very interesting. I'm curious about fair use.
Yeah.
If I'm producing a TV show or a movie, and I want to feature just the top of a Frank Sinatra song, maybe the first 10 seconds to establish a point. Is that covered in fair use, or do I have to come to you and you're going to make some money?
Fair use is in the eye of the beholder. And it's it really is. It's actually it's gray for sure. Now, fair use in a documentary where, somebody's won, the Eagles won the Super Bowl, the news goes out, and the guy's listening to New York, New York. And that's playing in the car radio as he's being interviewed, and they end up using that clip in a documentary. That's fair use. They just happen to capture that song. Now, if they take that New York, New York, and then drag it into the next scene where it's going over establishing shots of New York, now you've crossed the line. Now you're no longer fair use. You've pulled it out of the car radio and put it into the movie, if that makes sense. So you'll notice in a lot of documentaries, this is a huge thing now. I can never get my head around it. It's almost like they'll prod the interviewee to say, hey, mention the name of the song when you're talking about Elvis Presley, and say, when I was doing Hound Dog, and then they'll cut to Ed Sullivan show and them Elvis singing Hound Dog. That's fair use because you're showing what that person is talking to. You got to be very careful with it because if you go too long, you might be able to make a stink. It's a tough one.
I learned the same thing. I learned the same thing with movie footage. If you're making a documentary and you want to show 10 seconds of Easy Rider and you're talking about what Peter Fonda was doing in the scene, it's fair use.
Right.
Because you're making an historical point by using the clip. But if you're just showing a clip show of they're going to charge you. No, I know about that. Absolutely. I actually did a documentary on The Great Escape, the Steve McQueen movie. And we have 4 minutes of the movie in the documentary, and we didn't pay MGM a dime.
Yeah. Yeah, you can get away with it. And unfortunately, if they come knocking on your door, you might end up having to pay somebody because sometimes it's just worth giving them a license fee to make it go away because nobody really wants to establish the lines. The famous one really was Happy Birthday. I don't know if you ever heard this story or not. So Happy Birthday was always considered owned by Warner Chappell Music Publishing. And there were a couple of young filmmakers who were making a documentary on the song. The two older ladies that wrote it, then the melody came in, or the melody existed, then the words came in later on, and how it became sort of ubiquitous, not just in the United States, but around the world. People in all languages sing the same Happy Birthday. And Warner Chappell wanted to charge them an arm and a leg. And they said, look, we've got a whole bunch of fair use in here, plus we also have stuff that we need to license, but we think this is actually public domain. Like the music, the actual instrumentation is written in the 1800s. They said, no, everything was redone. We own this whole thing. And they ended up going to court over it. Documents were produced, and it turns out that the song is public domain, and Warner Chappell lost I think it was their top 5 earner in the catalog.
Wow.
That's the reason why when you would go to a restaurant, they would sing a different version of Happy Birthday, because the ASCAP or BMI license would kick in and they would charge a fortune for that song.
Yeah, how do you enforce that?
There are people that'll go around and enforce it. They really will. I had a friend of mine who owned a gym, and they came and said to him, you play music here all day, you need an ASCAP license, and I think they hit him with like $1,100 for the year. He's like, I'm barely making it. You got to be kidding me. Take me to court. And they didn't take him to court. They went to the district attorney of Redondo Beach, and they said, we're going to pull your license to operate. And
Wow.
Hey, Seth, Gary Lamel was a dear friend, rest in peace. I trust you knew who Gary was, and perhaps you knew him. He was a sweetheart. So one day he says to me, let's have some fun. I want to show you what goes on here. And he took me over to meet the guy at Warner Chappell to talk about licensing Mac the Knife for the Darren story. And you would know who that guy is. He's an older guy. He's very sharp. So he said, so let me understand this. You're doing the Bobby Darin story in a film, and you want to play Mac the Knife. How would that movie without Mac the Knife? Well, we can't, you can't do it without Mac the Knife. This is interesting. This is going to be an interesting negotiation. Very tough, boy. I'll tell you, he was really tough. When they know that you have to have it, obviously it's a whole different negotiation. You've also been up against that, I'm sure. You've been on the side of probably somebody saying, I have to have that particular song. And that. And then,
Does Columbia TriStar exist as a TV production company anymore? No, because the Beach Boys. Same exact thing. Publishing beat them up. They did not think that they were going to get hit with the price of music that they got hit with, and basically put them under.
And going way back when to American Graffiti, I understand those things cost nothing. They were
nothing.
No big deal at all. Today, nothing. You have to make that movie $20 million for music, probably.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Close Encounters of the Third Kind ends with one of the most expensive Disney songs. What is it? Jiminy Cricket sings.
Jiminy Cricket?
Right? What is it?
Yeah.
I forget the name of the song right now.
Wish Upon a Star.
Wish Upon a Star. It ends with that. And my friend Jill licensed that from the Disney guys she said this guy was like 100 and he was in the law department and they got it for like $600. It was like, you couldn't get that today. I mean, there's no, you could get that today.
What's your biggest prize in the Sinatra catalog? What is the real top dog?
My Way. I'm just guessing.
My Way.
Or New York, New York.
My Way. New York, New York is ubiquitous for New York. Certainly, if you live there, that is your song. New Year's Eve, it's played. It's the first song played after Imagine when the ball drops. Every time the Yankees win a home game, it's New York, New York. But My Way's just a huge earner. I mean, it just is played at every funeral, every retirement.
Seth, tell the guys in the audience about My Way and funerals.
Oh, it's huge. Absolutely huge. I mean, it's got to be the number one. It's My Way at funerals and the unforgettable duet with Natalie at weddings, father-daughter dances. They're just absolutely massive. There was a guy that was trying to wrap up that business. Unfortunately, probably too many of us know this, but when you go to these memorial services now, the family will get, maybe a video memorial of their loved one that's played. They'll get like 5 or 6 copies of it. And of course, when you put My Way in it or any copyright, it's really an infringement. Now, no one's going to police that. No one's going after Uncle Larry for, putting that stuff in his wife's, funeral video or somebody's wedding video. But then this stuff started ending up on YouTube and some of them took off. And, how do you end up policing that? So there was a guy that was trying to wrap that up to make it legitimate and it just never worked. Unfortunately, people just couldn't get their head around the fact that they had to pay for that during a time of grief.
Well, Arthur and I grew up with rock and roll, and I know you've been involved with the Dupreys and the Crests and this co-ed records. Talk a little bit about that and how that happened. And I know that you have some of those songs that I loved that were 16 Candles
to
begin with. Yeah.
I own that record label, so I'm really proud of that. So I ended up with some private equity about 15 years ago, and we were going up and trying to buy up a whole bunch of distressed properties. Really, it was a lot of these older catalogs that, whether the original owner was just done with it, the business was just starting to change at that point. So CDs were still around, but everybody was moving to digital. YouTube was starting to come out. A lot of these guys didn't know how to do this anymore. And the business was falling apart for them, where they weren't just licensing and, making $20,000 to sell an album. They didn't know how to monetize this on streaming. It wasn't sort of set up yet. So we ended up buying the Co-Ed Records catalog. And just this, it's amazing. We thought we were buying about 30 masters. And as we were getting the master shipped to us, I got a phone call. And it was this guy in New York who said, "Hey, I was the engineer for Buzz Curtis, who was the guy that bought it from the original owners. And Buzz is sick now, but I have all these master tapes that I was digitizing for him. Do you want me to continue this process or what do you want to do?" I said, "Well, what do you have?" He said, "I got about 70 tapes here." Couldn't believe. We ended up buying, we found unbelievable songs and recordings from that time period. And they went from 1958 to about 1963. And in about 61, when the Crests sort of didn't break up, but Johnny Maestro went on his way as a solo artist, and that sort of went away. The Dupreys were sort of figuring out what they wanted to do. They started following all the change in music at that point. So you start to hear Beatles guys, like songs that are sounding like the Beatles and songs that sound like Louis Armstrong and songs, all these. It just gets a crazy time. The Beach Boys, all of a sudden you get some beach sound music, and it's really just this great little hidden gem. I love it. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Seth, I got to know Donnie Kirshner very well. Became good friends with Donnie Kirshner, and he and Alan Evans sold their catalog publishing stuff in 1962, I believe it was, for like $2.5 million. A lot of money. Yeah. Charlie Koppelman bought that catalog in 1995 for like $350 million. That's the value of those nice rock and roll songs,
Yeah.
They all had melody. Great stuff. Yeah.
Great stuff.
I've got a Sinatra trivia question. I don't know if this is if there's an answer to this, but my favorite Sinatra song is "It Was a Very Good
Yeah.
Year." I play it almost daily in the car. It just resonates with me. Is there a longer version of that, Seth, or is that the version?
I don't know if there's a longer version, actually. I think that's the version that I'm aware of. Um, Frank was not known for doing tremendous amounts of takes. so he sort of did the one thing, and that was what he went with. There could have been, though. I mean, there could have been. It sounds like it would have been in a song like that they
Well,
would have
you've
gone
got
on and on.
17, you've got
Yeah.
you got 17, you got 21, you got 35. I was waiting for the 56, but I never got
Who owns the Beatles stuff today?
Capitol, Universal.
They do.
Yeah.
What must the value of that be? My God.
The Beatles catalog.
Yeah, it must be incredible.
Oh my
$1 billion?
God. Yeah, I'd probably bet it's over $1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how true this story is, but supposedly Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney were talking, and supposedly McCartney was talking about trying to make a deal with on his stuff, and it turned out that Michael Jackson went and made the deal for himself.
Yeah.
Have you heard that story?
True, Julian.
Yeah, no, that's a true story. That's a true story. And McCartney said, well, I wasn't going to pay. He didn't outbid it. He said, I still get my writer's share. I'm sure he regrets that to this day. I mean, that's one of the most valuable catalogs on the planet. And you'll notice if you'll notice it's loosening up. You'll notice you're hearing more Beatles covers on syncs, on TV and film and things like that. That was because when Capitol Records did Twist and Shout for Ferris Bueller's Day Off, it's really one of the only times you ever hear the Beatles in a movie. The Beatles had a 2-page contract back then. It was one of those standard sign here, here's your record royalties, and everything else was silent, meaning it didn't mention what you could do with film and television. It wasn't contemplated back in '63 when they came to the States. So the record label's philosophy was always, if it's silent, we have the right. And I guess a different type of presidential power with the record label. And so they went out, and when they got the request for Ferris Bueller's Day Off, they did the deal. And it was something like $5,000. I mean, it was not a lot of money.
Well,
and that set off the famous Beatles lawsuit with Capitol Records, where they accused Capitol Records of being, the Teamsters and part of the mob, and just I think you can still find the agreement online, the lawsuit online. It is literally one of the best reads you'll ever read about if you want to know what the music business is like.
I have to tell you, I was in that world in New York in those days, when they came on the scene, early 60s, and I was in the Brill Building in 1650 Broadway and Tin Pan Alley. That was my world. And you have no idea how many people were saying about the Beatles when they first came on the scene. They'll be around for about 6 months to a year. That's it. There's nothing. That happened with Elvis Presley too, some 6 years earlier. So who knows? It's always the same thing, isn't it?
Well, they said the same thing about Frank. All the Crosby people, right? They said this is never going to last. And they said the same thing about Bing Crosby. Oh, this will never last because we went. So yeah.
I wonder if they'll say the same thing about Kendrick Lamar.
Never last. Yeah, exactly.
Explain that, Seth. Having seen the Super Bowl, explain what the hell we saw at halftime.
Oh, don't ask me.
It's unbelievable.
And in all fairness, I have an 88-year-old friend who's gone blind, and so we try to get him out of the house all the time. So I had him over to our friend's house for the Super Bowl party, and he was tired at halftime, so I took him home. I did not see the halftime show. So I'm not trying to skip out, but from what I understand, the explanations have been amazing. I know people that have written on social media, I did not understand this, and then went back after people explained it to them and said, wow, this is really deep, but I really don't know.
Well, I can tell you for a fact that my text to my friend during the Super Bowl is, where is Frank Sinatra when we need him?
Well, the funny thing is, People Magazine put out right before that I think the top 5 performances, and one of them is Natalie Cole, who's my client, and that's considered one of the top 5. I'm trying to work with the NFL to see if we can somehow maybe get like a YouTube channel with these great halftime performances and make them legal, not somebody just filming it off the television. and get them to think a little differently about these things, because there's some really epic performances up there.
Seth, you mentioned that you also represent some TV shows. I'm curious what shows in the catalog you represent.
Well, when I had Nat King Cole, we had the Nat Cole television show, which was the first TV show hosted by an African American in the United States. It was ran from 57 to 58 on NBC. They couldn't get sponsors except for Reinhold beer out of Texas. United Airlines was a sponsor for them, but they could never get anybody nationally. And the South refused to run the show because he was a black entertainer.
And I think it was only a 15-minute show, as I remember.
In the beginning, it was, and it was so wildly popular that they made it a 30-minute show, and then it became an hour-long show. And remember, this was not an interview show; this was all music.
Yes, he played.
And then they ended up putting him, I think, on Saturday nights, and that killed him. That's when he knew it was done. And it's really amazing because he stayed home to do this show. He stayed in LA, and he would run up to San Francisco and Oregon and Washington to do shows on the weekend and pop out to Las Vegas because he could get home. And we ended up finding all these lost tapes. Bootleggers would go into these venues and record with the permission of the venue and really with the permission of the artist, because there was no real market. How could people weren't duping reel-to-reel tapes and passing them around on the corners of New York City. And so we ended up finding some of these unbelievable performances of him that people recorded literally off the board in these real small clubs.
It would be no secret. It would be no secret to say that Nat Cole was one of the world's greatest lovers. Nat Cole was known; he was a lover, and
yes, he was
probably the most unique, great singing voice of all time. I mean, his voice was somewhere you just don't hear it. There was a guy years ago named Earl Grant who kind of sounded like him, and that was the whole thing. He sounds like Nat Cole, but not too much. Nat Cole was great.
There's even Freddie Cole, his brother, who sounds somewhat like him as well. But it's interesting about those shows. How about the Sinatra show that was on ABC? Is that part of the estate? Or
yeah, we own those. We own copies of those. There was no copyright law in the United States, federal copyright law, before 1972. It was all based on the states. And so a lot of those shows ended up falling into the public domain if you put that little C registration at the end of the show. And most times that stuff just did not exist. Yeah. And we all know the stories about, It's a Wonderful Life falling out of copyright before computers. Just a lot of things slipped through. But we have the Dean Martin show. Dean Martin had his show from 61 to 81. And so we co-own those first 10 years with NBC.
Do you own the Christmas show, Seth? They did a Christmas show, Sinatra Families and Dean Martin.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure who owns that specifically. I'm sure there's some ownership all across the board. When the estates get into this type of thing, everybody just sort of says, "Look,
Chef,
we don't know."
What was the name of the guy who worked with Norman Lear and bought the rights to the Sinatra TV shows in the late 80s, maybe?
Oh, yeah. I forget what his name was.
He gave him $1 million. He gave him $1 million. What was his name? I forget the great guy.
Yeah, I forget his name, too. He passed away when I started getting involved with the Coles. But he was very involved with them, too.
He died. So anyway, he gave him $1 million, and the money went to Frank Jr. and Nancy and Tina. And so as the story goes, Mickey Rudin brought him to Palm Springs one day to meet Frank, and so he brings me to Sinatra, and he says, "Frank, here's the young guy I told you, $1 million for the kids. It's nice, and Frank says, "Hi, how you doing?" And the fellow we're talking about says to him, "Frank, it's so big in Australia and New Zealand and all these foreign countries." And Frank said, "That's great. Maybe you'll make me famous." True story.
I was interested to know. I hear recently that every year they announce the things that are going into public domain.
Yes.
They announced that Singing in the Rain, the great song title, now is a public domain title. Is anything in your catalog heading in that direction, Seth? Although your performers are still fairly not that long.
Yeah, masters recordings are all different than songwriters. It's a very complicated process, and it's different in every country. So 1961 and earlier is public domain in the UK. I think it's 1963 and earlier is public domain in Europe. Here, it's life of the writer. So on the publishing side, I think it's when the writer died plus 75 years, and then the recording is when it was released. Then some kind of tie-in with the performer when they passed away. And I mean, it's crazy. You really do need a specific, a lawyer that's a professional in that world to know exactly when and where you go public domain. So you had mentioned the Coed Records catalog. That's a lot of that's public domain in Europe. So I have to compete with those streaming services because Spotify is a global company. So how do I compete with some kid over there who decides to throw up Coed's, the Crest's greatest hits up on Spotify, and you can play it here where it's not public domain? So I got to try to block that. It's not public domain in Canada. It's not public domain in Mexico or Australia or India. So how do you balance that? It's very, very complicated. I mean, this is where globalization would really benefit because it is so difficult to manage this. And a lot of times innocent people get caught up in getting themselves in a lot of trouble, not knowing. A lot of the Asian countries, they don't have copyright law. It's not as stringent as we have. So people will go over. I don't know if you watch any of these, contraband shows or border shows on the National Geographic Channel, but people will go over to Thailand or Vietnam and they'll buy purses. They think, they're, whatever they are, they're, famous knockoffs. And they come into the United States with those. And that's actually can get you in a lot of trouble. I mean, fines, they just don't confiscate it. They can put you in jail for distributing. It's really difficult.
It's such a huge business, the music business. Seth, what kind of value is there to things like the Irving Berlin estate or the Gershwin's estate or Rodgers and Hammerstein? My Lord, and that's an ongoing gold mine, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, because they're very old catalogs, they're going to go public domain. They'll never go away. I mean, we're still playing Mozart and Beethoven and Handel and Bach. So, it's just a matter of how are people going to deal with that? Are they going to change copyright law because those estates are very powerful? It's a very powerful set of music. And how are you going to change that? Are you? The Beatles changed copyright law in England and the UK because it used to be 1958. Now all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, all our hits are going to go into the public domain. You guys can't do this to us. So they changed it. We'll see. The reason that we have strict name and likeness laws in this country is because of Tennessee, because of Elvis Presley. And that's the reason why you don't see Elvis impersonators outside of Nevada, because you can't do it. You'll get sued. Nevada has some of the most lenient name and likeness laws, which is why you have Rat Pack shows and all that stuff.
Well, everyone sort of lets it go. The Rat Pack shows tour the country, do they not?
It's very difficult to do. You can't use imagery. You can certainly go out and do parody. That's not a problem at all, but you can't do imagery. And the problem with Elvis is that's imagery.
I heard the problem with the Chinese is they don't pronounce it the same way we do. They say copy, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the joke is you manufacture in China once. Right? That's it.
They're tough to do business with. Impossible.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, Seth. I as a filmmaker, I hope someday to come to your offices with money in my hands.
We are open for licensing.
I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful host and producer, Mike Faber. This has been great. I mean, this is, as you point out, this is a part of the business a lot of people don't really know too much about.
No.
I mean, this is an area that is a major part of the business in licensing, and particularly over at the Disney studios, they seem to be very interested in that area.
Yeah,
absolutely. But I want to say something, if I may. Having worked with Seth a little bit, Seth is big leaguer all the way, just a class act. And I can imagine anyone who does come to negotiate with you they come out feeling good, no matter what the price is. You know what you're doing. You're a credit to what you do, and it's great. It's always great to deal with a big league guy, and I admire that, Seth. I want you to know that.
I appreciate that, Arthur. Thank you, everybody. Really nice to meet you guys. It was a lot of fun.
Mike, we turn it over to you.
You've reached the end of this episode of the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you could also find us wherever fine podcasts are found. And now you could even find us up on our YouTube channel. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Or if you're listening, why not give us 5 stars? If you're into social media, please check us out up on Instagram and Facebook. Before we get out of here, let's check with the guys and see what's happening on their podcast. Julian, who are you talking to this week?
Oh, this week is part 2 of Stephen Lang, the man who was the big antagonist in Avatar, and also known for Gettysburg and Don't Breathe and so many movies. Did over 100 movies, guys. Over 100 movies.
That is awesome. Steve, what's cooking over on Saturday night at the movies?
I'm going to reach back into my archives, and I am going to bring out the interview I did with Albert R. Broccoli in 1977, where he talks about how he got involved in the James Bond movies.
Oh, awesome.
He also made a hell of a vegetable.
Well, his family did that. That's not a...
I know, it's true.
Yeah, they brought the broccoli seed to America in the late 1800s.
That is cool. Arthur, what's coming up next week on our podcast?
We're going to confront the question, what happened to comedies in movies? We're going to talk about comedies, old ones, new ones, and hopefully future ones. But comedy is king, and we'll be talking about comedies.
That is awesome. Can't wait to talk all about that. On behalf of Steve, Arthur, and Julian, thanks again for listening. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber, and we'll see you here next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. Your Hollywood adventure starts right here.
Howdy! A new year means it's time for a new season of the Dragon Con Report.
We're here to help you plan, learn more about the con, and make the most of your trip.
From guest announcements to tips for navigating the con, we've got you covered.
Catch the latest episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
Because Dragon Con is better when you're ready for it.
The Dragon Con Report, your ultimate guide to the con of all cons.
Subscribe now and start your adventure.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.